Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Tales from the Wandering Quill. I am your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill. Today we are doing another book impression, and this book comes courtesy of indie author Ravven White. And her book that we are going to review is The Sentimental Dead. Now, The Sentimental Dead is an interesting one. Namely, for me in particular, it's the first vampire fiction story I've ever read. Now, for those who may know me or have followed me, I typically don't read a lot of horror fiction or horror novels. That's not to say I don't enjoy them, it's just that they're not my preferred choice. But this one was very interesting for me. Namely because reading it, which I did, it was actually a fantastic read, it's not your typical vampire story that we have seen thus far. It's not like a war between vampires and the humans, or kind of like this ancient blood feud, or something like that. It's actually very different. It's kind of reminiscent to other vampire stories that don't really get talked about as much. One of the similarities I found with the Sentimental Dead is that it reminded me a lot of Daybreakers, the movie with Ethan Hawke, with the vampires kind of running low on the human food supply and trying to make synthetic ways to survive. Now, I say it's similar is because in this reality, it's a post-dystopian world where you have vampires and humans kind of living in a uneasy truce between the two. You also have sort of like a distinction in the hierarchy. You have those that are the elites or the true-born vampires, and those that are recently turned. Hence they get the nickname Turned. Now, this story is also reminiscent of very Gothic literature from the Victorian era in terms of the word choice, the presentation of characters, the story structure itself, and the imagery. It's a very Gothic, very dark world that the characters live in. And what's interesting about the story is also how each chapter is presented. Now, in each story, it has this, again, very Victorian Gothic presentation. So this is how the story begins if you open up The Sentimental Dead. And then, when you transfer over to the next few pages, you have this kind of almost like a prayer or some kind of prophetic saying, which is really, really fascinating. It really sets a tone of what the world is and what you should expect. But here's the one thing I really enjoyed about this book. For each chapter, there are 16 chapters, it has sort of a phrase. So for chapter 1, it has, "And a great darkness shall come from within. It will cover the sins of both ancient and new." So each chapter has its own individual phrase that's very specific to it, which I think is really unique. It really sets this book from the other vampire stories in its genre. Now, what is this world about? What is the Sentimental Dead? Well, according to the official synopsis and story, here is the world. In a world left in ruins and chaos from an apocalyptic war, humans and vampires are forced to coexist in a shattered wasteland. And thus, we have a new world. Trust is a rare commodity, and so is blood. In the midst of this is Emile Thorn, a turned vampire who never asked to be. Angry and bitter over the death of his family and a transformation he cannot remember, he, along with his companions and best friend Ash, hunt monsters and rogues in an attempt to bring peace to their dystopian society. But monsters aren't the only things that threaten Emile's vampire existence. Tumultuous change forces him to reevaluate his life and confront a darkness that lingers in the recesses of his soul. Lost fragments of his past begin to surface as he struggles with the age-old questions. Are we born monsters, or do we become them? So, that kind of sets up the whole story. It's a very bleak, very dark, very, very grim world of the Sentimental Dead. Now, I must let you all know, this book does have trigger warnings, so for the first book, The Sentimental Dead, because it's part of a series, it contains acts of violence, blood consumption, and weapons. And I just want to let you know this does exist in a few chapters, and I just want to let you all know that. However, if you are not easily triggered by this, I think you will enjoy the story. And honestly, if you're a fan of Gothic literature and want to read something different, then I highly recommend you pick up The Sentimental Dead. It is on Amazon to buy. And I urge you all to support Ravven White, as well as check out her own works and the works she published. Yes, that is correct. Ravven White is in charge of her own publishing house called Corvid Publishing, which I will link in the description below this video. So if you want to not only support The Sentimental Dead, but also the other authors that are signed on with Curious Corvid Publishing. And with that, listeners, this concludes my book impressions of The Sentimental Dead. Now, as I said before, I don't typically read a lot of vampire stories, but this one was definitely a refresher. It's not like Twilight, it's not like Interview with a Vampire, it's not like, it's not a movie, but the Underworld franchise. It's a refresher. It's a new take on the whole vampire lore and mythos. So I give this a 5 out of 5 quills. It is a really good book. It's easy to read. It's easy along to follow. It's 16 chapters. You could probably read this whole book in a day. And make sure to check out also my audio impressions of The Sentimental Dead, as I'll be reading the first few chapters of The Sentimental Dead on my podcast, which I will also link in the description below. Thank you all for joining me, and I will let you in on the next episode very soon.